So I am going to focus mainly on the peer review, which was published in 2010, and give a sort of peer's perspective on the strengths and challenges for Japanese ODA. Sorry, I'll just check I'm going the right way with this. No. Yeah. So, three main things I want to talk about. First, a little bit of background about what the peer reviews are and the peer review of Japan for those that don't know, and I'll be very quick on that. And then move on to some findings coming out of the peer review, starting with a few facts and figures, then some positive trends and a few challenges. Some of which on both sides we've discussed already, but I'll just pick up on a few of those. And then briefly I want to talk about possible implications for the future of Japanese ODA, since that's the topic of today, but I will probably leave you with more questions than answers on that. Oops. That's it, yeah. Pressing the wrong button.
Just a time lag, I think.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say, just a few basics on peer reviews, and I won't dwell long on this. They're a hallmark approach of the OECD. We conduct them in the areas of economic governance, environment, public regulation, and so on. Every country gets reviewed roughly about 5 years, and that's really based on our resources and how often we come round to countries when there's 24 of them in total. The other thing to note is the peer element of them. That's very much crucial. And in the case of Japan, we had, we always have 2 reviewing countries, and in the case of Japan, they were Germany and Denmark, 2 very different countries, and they were able to offer a perspective from their own systems that's different, but also understand a little bit of the political context. The ultimate objective of all these peer reviews is to change behaviour, and we do that in 2 ways, really, looking at both accountability and learning. So holding donors accountable for what they've signed up for, whether it's how much they're spending or how they're going to manage their aid, and on learning within that donor, but also sharing that across the donor community. I should also emphasise before we go any further that we do have a very limited scope. We don't look at impacts on development. We're looking at policies and how those play out on the ground and so on. If we were to look at impacts, we'd need a much bigger team and budget to do that, so we keep ourselves strictly focused. A few notes on the Japanese peer review. It was quite a long time coming because the previous one was in 2003. I mentioned the reviewing countries, Germany and Denmark. Denmark's very different from Japan, different end of the spectrum in the donor world. Germany actually has quite a lot of similarities, and it was interesting to see the exchange between the senior officials talking about their systems and their challenges. We went to Tokyo in October 2009, and the 2 countries that we visited to follow up were Bangladesh and Kenya. And obviously we interviewed very many people, lots of Japanese officials, partner government officials, other stakeholders, so on and so forth. So having sped through that, starting with the findings on just a little bit of background information about the statistics that we have. This slide is basically there to explain 2 things. One, that the Japanese ODA budget has fluctuated quite a lot. It's been up and down. But the second is really to say that this is a lot of money. Japan is a big donor. Even in years where it's been cutting, it's always been above 8 billion US a year. This is substantial money and not to be sniffed at. And so though Japan gets a lot of criticism because it's so far from the 0.7 target, it's a big donor. I think in 2010 it was at 0.2, and that's up from the previous year. And in the 2011 budget, unsurprisingly, there's been quite a big cut, so it may go down again. But okay, it doesn't score well on the 0.7 target, but it does score well. It was the 5th biggest donor in 2010, I think. The other thing, the 2 colours on the slide that you can see, the colour below is multilateral and the lighter blue is bilateral, and so that's just to highlight that bilateral aid does dominate Japanese ODA. But because of the mere size, that doesn't mean that Japan isn't a big player in the main multilateral institutions, particularly the international, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. The size of the Japanese contribution is really significant. This slightly squished pair of pies is really just to make a point about the geographic focus, and I think this has been alluded to already. The one on the left you can see is 5 or so years ago, and then the one on the right more recent. If you look at the blue piece of pie, that's sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see how that's grown over the period. Partly that's in response to commitments Japan has made at Gleneagles through the TICAD programme. So there is a shift. Their focus on their neighbourhood isn't as strong as it used to be. And there's a lot of discussions, or there were a lot of discussions in Tokyo and elsewhere when we were there, about what Japan may need to do differently and adapt for the different types of countries that it's working in. This graph also indicates something I think Alina mentioned before, which is that Japan's very heavily present in middle-income countries and is increasingly now getting involved in less developed countries. Another thing Alina also mentioned is the spread of Japanese aid across countries, and the basic reason for that is because aid is considered to be a key foreign policy tool. So you don't withdraw it. It's part of your embassy's life to at least have a small program, even if there isn't a JICA office there. It's an important aspect. And Japan also doesn't name priority countries, as some European donors do. I think in a way they might consider that a sort of diplomatic incident to tell a country that they're not a priority. But you can see in the figures that there is some concentration, so it's not a spray gun. Finally, on the statistics, this is about the loan to grant ratio. The fact that Japan uses concessional loans, and they're such a large feature of the programme, is really important. It's a very distinctive feature of Japanese ODA, and I attach no negativity or positivity to that whatsoever. But it's more unusual amongst DAC members to have a large loan proportion like that. And the two different graphs you can see, the one on the left is about commitments, the one on the right is about actual disbursements. So what the one on the left is showing you is that there hasn't been a decline in the last few years in new commitments made under loans, indicating that loans will continue to be an absolute core feature of the Japanese aid programme. And the use of loans fits very well with the Japanese emphasis on self-help in development. It does all fit together in terms of a strategic logic and so on. Then quickly on to some of our findings, starting with the positive trends. The first thing I wanted to mention was that we really saw a much clearer strategic vision. At the time of the peer review before, Japan had just agreed its ODA charter, which set that out. By the time we went back in 2009, what we saw was that had really bedded down, and there was also a medium-term strategic framework, which in our peer review we talked about the time coming to update that and opportunities to perhaps plug some holes and some gaps in that. And another aspect I think perhaps has also already been alluded to, and that's Mrs. Agata's emphasis on human security, and she's been very strong in pushing that. And what's notable, I think, more recently is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as opposed to JICA, Madam Agata's president of JICA, they are also now pushing or talking a lot more about human security as well. Second point I wanted to mention as a plus is both consistency and reliability. In a way, that's two different things. The consistency is Japan's policy framework is fairly stable. It's not one of those countries where it flies to the left and then to the right every 5 years. There's some consistency there. And that in itself, it does provide some stability. On the reliability, it's a slightly different point. We talk a lot about predictability in development, and especially in relation to their aid effectiveness agenda. And generally, Japan doesn't come out looking strong on the measures we have for predictability, despite the fact they have now got some rolling plans which they share with partners, which is very helpful. But one thing we heard time and again from its bilateral partners, i.e. its government partners in Kenya and Bangladesh, was that they considered Japan to be very reliable. that's because once a big Japanese project is agreed, you know, often it's these a bridge or a road or something like that. They're over 7 years or something like that, and there will be an annual disbursement plan. And when that plan is agreed, it may take a long time to get to the point of agreement. When that plan is agreed, Japan sticks to it, and partner countries really, really appreciate that. So what we heard from partners was, oh really? I must be talking too much. They saw a machine that was slow to get going but could be counted on in the end. The next point is debt sustainability. And really the point here is that Japan do now use World Bank criteria when deciding when to commit loans, and that's an advancement. Thinking and acting big. Japan is a big donor. We've mentioned that. That in itself is relevant. But what's changed and could make this really more valuable is that it's moved from operating in silo-based channels, 3 different channels, the technical cooperation, the loans and the grants, and bringing them together into a single country envelope. So the unit of thinking is now the country, which leads me to my next point, which is about the organisational consolidation. It's the new JICA. It was born in 2008, which brings these different channels together. And there's a real opportunity here to create greater coherence. Of course, it's a big change, and there'll be teething problems and so on. And but this is really important, and a big change that we saw as a very positive thing. Another positive, increased engagement in aid coordination mechanisms. All I'll say on that is that there has been an increase, but we didn't conclude that Japan was yet engaging as much as it could, or and there might be further to go. I'll skip the point about building metaphorical bridges, because I think Alina has talked about it. This is about engaging with new donors. I think less so China and more countries like Indonesia. And I will also only briefly tell you about the engagement from Japanese civil society, which is still not as enormous or as significant as it might be in some European countries, but it's really quite significantly changed in the last 2 years. And overall, the 2010 peer review was a lot more positive than the 2003 one. Then on the challenges, I'm going to start with one which is a clear point of disagreement with my neighbour, which is about untying. All DAC donors have signed up to untie their aid under a 2001 recommendation. A recommendation in DAC terms is as strong as it gets. Then we had the Accra Agenda for Action that talks about going further with untying. And we noted in the report that Japan has increased the amount of aid, or the proportion of its aid that's untied. And you can find the figures in the report. But we also raised the issues of the increased use of an overtly tied loan program called STEP, and also how Japan reports its tying status, something that was raised in the previous review in 2003. And I won't spend long talking about this, but we do consider it an ongoing issue. Then I wanted to mention implementing new good practice across the system. It sounds a bit vague, but what I'm talking about here is the advances that have been made on paper and in discussions, and good practice in mainstreaming issues like gender and environment, on making sure capacity development is sustainable and so on. I'm being told I have to go a little faster. So I think I would just pick up then on 2 points. Getting the benefits out of new JICA. There's a real opportunity here to streamline more and become a more nimble donor, a more nimble organisation in general. At the moment, there's a lot of layers of approval, and going back to Tokyo at every turn slows things down. And then lastly, communicating about Japanese aid and making the Japanese voice heard in international forums. Given the size of the Japanese aid programme, you'd think you'd hear the Japanese voice a lot more in the international stage, in the boards of multilaterals and so on. But we'd say that they're perhaps punching below their weight in this area, and we could hear more from them. And the same at the field level in the aid coordination mechanisms. Yes, Japanese officials are attending more, but their voice isn't always heard in meetings. and then also communicating back home. I will not say too much more about that because I'd better wrap up under time pressure. Implications for the future, I'll just raise two things then. The comparative advantage, do they have one? If we're going to say that it's big infrastructure, which there is a case for, then I think then a few things need to be addressed to really make sure that Japan is a leader in the development field, which means looking at untying. It means looking at the sustainability and the appropriateness of the technology and the impacts of projects on local communities and so on, which JICA is very much trying to do at the moment, but it's sort of an ongoing challenge. And it also means being involved in areas around infrastructure that may be relevant, including governance and regulation in that area, which can provide barriers. So it doesn't mean you just have people that know about building roads. It means you need gender experts, it means you need regulatory experts, and so on and so forth. And the other issue is communication, and I was very interested to learn that the third and final phase of the project that Alina is running is really about communication, because this is something that we saw as a real issue, because Japanese aid has changed, and it has still got something of a bad reputation from perhaps the way it worked 20 years ago. And I think that JICA, or perhaps even more so the MFA, need to be a bit more proactive, getting out there and selling Japanese aid, so perhaps in the same way that you see the UK doing. They're very vociferous in the international community. The UK knows how to sell whatever it's decided to do, and telling everyone that that's the way to do it. So there's something I think that Japan can take from that. And one very final point on communication, which is more of a domestic issue but very much related, and that is it appeared to us there was a marked absence of involvement, of substantive involvement from Japanese parliamentarians. Again, you can see the UK at the other end of the spectrum on this. And the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was perhaps quite comfortable with this because they didn't get trouble from parliamentarians, except the occasional question about a corruption case. But it also means they don't have that constituency of support when trouble comes along. And that's an area where I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in particular needed to be more proactive if they want to build that support a bit more. Thank you.